todas. Nos da mucho gusto tener como invitada aquí especial a Rachel Laudan. Y antes de comenzar también con la exposición de Rachel, quiero presentar a la nueva integrante del Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas, Lara Ascaglia. A ver si pueden enfocar a Lara. Para que se vea también por internet. Ella va a estar trabajando en el área de historia de la filosofía aquí en el instituto. Bienvenida, Lara. Bienvenida. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Y bueno, te dejo la palabra a Carlos.
Bueno, buenos días, tardes, en esa ambigüedad que todos tenemos justo a mediodía, aunque ahorita ya se pasó, ya es buenas tardes. Bueno, para iniciar esta serie de seminarios de investigadores del instituto correspondiente al semestre que inicia, pues tenemos un broche de oro, como se dice. Estamos iniciando a un altísimo nivel y además muy contentos porque está con nosotros nuestra muy querida y admirada colega Rachel Laudan, que como algunos de ustedes sabrán, ha estado muy cerca del instituto muchos años y ha dejado sembradas amistades y afectos. Rápidamente, creo que parte de la charla se tratará de su biografía intelectual, por lo que puedo ver, entonces no voy a indagar mucho ahí. Ella inició su carrera académica como historiadora de la ciencia, específicamente de la geología, en donde contribuyó a mediados del siglo XX y en la segunda parte del siglo XX con trabajos fundamentales en la historia de las ciencias de la Tierra. Simplemente mencionaremos su libro From Mineralogy to Geology, que apareció en el 87 en Chicago University Press. Innumerables colecciones, papers, en fin, fue una historiadora, ha sido una historiadora de la geología activa y productiva. Y en un momento dado de su carrera, creo que estando en Hawái, empezó a desarrollar, o quizá ya lo traía de antes, interés por la cocina, por la gastronomía y su historia global, ¿no? Y produjo, mientras estuvo en México, ese importantísimo libro que todos usamos para enseñar y para hacer ver cómo la gastronomía puede verse como una historia no solo de práctica, sino también de intelectual, ¿no? Y cultural, que se llama Cuisine and Empire. Bueno, en fin, como ya dije, muchas personas aquí en el instituto le tenemos mucho afecto a Rachel. Mañana se iniciará el homenaje programado para el filósofo de la ciencia, compañero de Rachel, Larry Laudan, pero bueno, hoy se trata de escuchar su presentación en el seminario que lleva como título The Cinderella Science, Intellectual Obstacles Facing the History and Philosophy of Geology in the Mid-20th Century. Rachel, adelante.
Gracias, Carlos. Thanks for that very generous introduction, and thanks to everybody for inviting me back to the Instituto. It feels like a second home. I'm going to talk in English, I'm afraid. In the last 10 years, I have forgotten a lot of my Spanish, and I know that you're all really good at understanding English. This paper is very much a work in progress. It happened because on Twitter, that invaluable intellectual resource, I got into conversation earlier this year with Alyssa Bokulich at Boston University, who is trying to encourage the history and philosophy of what is now called the geosciences. And Alyssa was organizing a program in the Boston Colloquium for the History and Philosophy of Science on the philosophy of the geosciences, and she approached me as a grand old woman of the philosophy of the geosciences and asked me to talk about what it was like to try to talk about the history and philosophy of geology back in the 1960s and 1970s. And I was delighted to do it because it's a time of my life when I'm interested in sort of revisiting things and, you know, bringing things around in a circle. And so I said yes, not realizing quite what a struggle it would be to think myself back 50 years into what I was doing a long time ago. What I want to do now is to introduce it by my personal experience and also by an interesting meeting that took place in 1960. Then I want to talk about 3 different ways in which it was intellectually very difficult to approach philosophy of geology, and then say a few words in conclusion. Okay, so I studied geology as an undergraduate at the University of Bristol. It wasn't very common for women then, but I loved it. And I was admitted to a PhD program in geology at Lamont Doherty Laboratory in Columbia University. In my last semester as an undergraduate, we had to take a history of science course. I don't know why, but it was a disaster. What the university did was to take the oldest member of each department and say, you can teach a seminar on the history of physics, geology, chemistry, what have you. And, oh dear, I'm trying to make some kind of sense of it. Because I really wanted to get a good degree, I went off to the library and looked up geology and history thereof, and came across a small book by Stephen Toulmin and June Goodfield called The Discovery of Time. It was part of a 3-volume series put out by the Nuffield Foundation in the 1960s to try to give people a better idea of what science was about. And I think some of us around here probably know that little series, right? It was it was wonderful. Oh my goodness, instead of one damn discovery and invention after another, here were stories about the history of science that you could actually comprehend and make sense of. And I thought, this is just fantastic. And I wandered around a bit more, and I found Norwood Russell Hansen's Patterns of Discovery, and that seemed really interesting too. And then I found Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and that, oh my goodness. So I changed from geology, and I thought I would do history and philosophy of science at the University College London, which I did. And because I'd come from geology, I chose to do my dissertation on geological mapping, which, as somebody who'd spent 3 years spending a huge amount of time trying to learn how to do this very complex, very theoretical act of making a geological map, not mere description. You have a topographic map, you wander, here it's easy because you've got lots of rocks at the surface, but in most places you don't. So you have to try to find places where you can see rocks and then extrapolate from their appearance, think where else they might be, put it on this map. It's a very complicated business. So that's what I spent the next few years doing. Nobody was very excited about this, to put it mildly. And I won't go into that, but I will now move on to this 1960 meeting at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. I think it was there because a man called Claude C. Albritton, who was quite a good geologist, was also interested in history and philosophy of geology. And it was a tiny meeting. Actually, my husband Larry would have liked it because he liked tiny meetings where people really talked to each other. And it was convened by the Geological Society of America in preparation for its 75th anniversary. And there were just about 10 or 12 people there. It was a response to a recommendation made a decade earlier by a committee of 3, headed by one of America's most distinguished geologists, M. King Hubbert, who thought that geology badly needed a critical re-examination from the ground up of the logical structure of geological science. And it was written up by Albritton in a very brief little note that appeared in the unlikely place of the Journal of the Graduate Research Center of Southern Methodist University. And Albritton bemoaned that Feigl and Brodbeck's Readings in Philosophy of Science, which was 800 pages long, and some of you probably used it when the older people here, when you were starting in philosophy of science, had no entry for geology. And so the question now was, what was it going to, could these 10 people come to some kind of agreement about the logical structure of geology? Well, they didn't. It was an absolute mutual incomprehension. And if you're now asking yourselves, why in the world are we interested in these minor events, 55 years ago, 60 years ago? I think what it shows to me are 2 things. One, it's very difficult for even actors in a particular activity, geologists in geology in this case, to understand what they're actually up to. They often have wildly concepts that do not really reflect the activity accurately. And I think the other thing it shows is the intellectual traps that we can build for ourselves when we get really nifty conceptual schemes that don't, in fact, that actually trap us rather than allowing us to explore phenomena. So I'm going to talk, I hope briefly, about geology as a historical science. Science is explanatory and the unity of science. If you don't have the handout, please turn to somebody next to you and ask them to share it with you. And science and society and the scientist as citizen, because I think all these interlocking intellectual threads of the mid-20th century are involved in this lack of understanding between the scientists and the philosophers. So first of all, geology as a historical science. Albritton, in his little outline, asks rhetorically, is geology a historical science, whatever that may mean? Did I put that? Where did I put this? Okay. You might like, while I'm talking here, to look at the right-hand column of the last page of the handout, which lists the areas of interest of the philosophers and the geologists. There is a general view that the geologists were happy to go along with, that stratigraphy or historical geology is really the aim of geology. Stratigraphy or historical geology is a chronology of what went on in the earth. And I'm sure you've all seen it. If you've ever been to some of the big science museums in the world, whether it's Chicago or Berlin or Paris or London or New York, there will be a diorama of the Earth's history. And at the left-hand end, there's the sort of little marine shells, and then you go to the ammonites, and then you go to the dinosaurs, and then you go to the mammals, and then you see man at the end of this. And this is kind of how geology is presented to the popular imagination, and to a large extent that has also captured the imagination of geologists and historians of science. It's described as the discovery of time very often, that was the title of the Toulmin and Goodfield book. And the method that is to be used for this is uniformitarianism, the idea that the laws of nature have never changed. Uniformitarianism was a term introduced in the mid-19th century by William Whewell in his book, The History of the Inductive Sciences. He described geology as a paleoetiological science, which is his complicated, classical, educated way of saying historical science. It was picked up by an incredibly influential book by Archibald Geikie called The Founders of Geology in 1905, that said that stratigraphy, historical geology, uniformitarianism were the central thread of geology, again by Toulmin and Goodfield in half a century later. Just after this meeting, Stephen Jay Gould said, is uniformitarian really necessary, in the American Journal of Science, saying, look, uniformity of law is not really necessary, and if it's something other than uniformity of law, it's wrong, and jump-started his career with that paper. And G.G. Simpson, the famous biologist, comes back to it again in 1970, and there's still a flood of books on deep time, the discovery of time, geology as the science that has taught us about how old the Earth is. Is this a good characterization of geology and what geologists do? Well, not really, no. Geologists don't go out and say, I want to discover time. They don't go out and think that that's what they're up. I mean, there are bits and pieces where this happens, but it's not what you do most of the time. You look down this list here, Hubbard was working on the plasticity of the Earth's crust and how long oil would be available in the world. Harry Hess was working on seafloor spreading, the precursor to plate tectonics. James Galooly was working on rapid mountain building and wrote the major textbook. Betts was working on environmental geology and industrial waste. Harrison on radioactive waste and geological maps. Hill on earthquakes and the San Andreas Fault. Fluvial geology and water management, volcanism, meteorology, and quaternary stratigraphy. None of quaternary stratigraphy aside, none of those are historical geology. None of them are looking for deep time. They're interested in the structure of the Earth and the processes that go on in the Earth. And that's what most geologists have done for most time. I think often you get this in the sciences, that the public imagination and even the presentation within the intellectual community picks up on something that is very dramatic. It is great that we have this diorama of the history of the Earth. And I don't want to deny that that's been terribly important, but it's not the whole story, and it badly distorts what goes on. Do both geologists and philosophers accept this story? Yes. I mean, the whole meeting, even with all these 8 or 10 really senior geologists sitting there, they're prepared to talk as if this is the story, is what geology does. The philosophers, of course, think this is hopelessly inadequate. Hempel and Goodman say they are unwilling to accept that the end of historical geology is the establishment of a chronicle for the earth. I've spelt that wrongly. Instead, what a science should do is explain by reference to general laws, and a chronology that the dinosaurs come after the ammonites and human beings come after the dinosaurs. That chronology is not an explanation. It's one thing after another. So Hempel and Goodman are very unhappy. This means that geology is not a science and therefore not very interesting. Hempel says in his Function of General Laws in History that the same characterization of a science should apply to all sciences, the natural sciences and the social sciences, and the aim of all these sciences is explanation by reference to general laws. Okay, too bad for geology. So now stepping back from this meeting to where could geologists turn to get some kind of, if they really believed that geology was a historical science and that chronology was in fact an important part of being a historical science, even if it wasn't explanation by reference to general laws. Well, the philosophy of history at that time was dominated, if you left aside the people who were trying desperately and unsuccessfully to fit the Hempel model to history. The only alternative was the people who said that narrative and agency were the characteristics of history. But of course, there isn't a narrative in geology, and there isn't agency, at least not human agency. So even if you turn outside the philosophy of science to people working in the philosophy of history, apart from, the Hempelians, geology doesn't make it there either. This, I think, is very sad. Chronology is not an easy thing to do. Newton, for example, as you probably know, spent many years of his life trying to work out human chronology when trying to figure out different time scales was actually a major intellectual enterprise. But because of these blinkers and the acceptance of the idea that geology is bounded by or limited to its attempt to create a chronology of the earth sciences, it just becomes completely outside the philosophy of science at this time. I would have liked the geologists to leap up and say, no, we do lots of other things, and if we don't have, we at least have major generalizations about the plasticity of the Earth's crust, or about mountain building, or about the consolidation of minerals when a rock cools. There were dozens of these things in geology. They're just not in the historical part. Okay, let's go on to science as explanatory. We've already hinted at that, or really almost covered it. The aim of science is to explain, was very much the view of the logical empiricists in this period. Hempel's covering law of explanation says that to explain a phenomenon is to show that its occurrence follows deductively from general law. And there's that famous 1948 paper by Hempel and Oppenheim, Studies in the Logic of Explanation. So Goodman turns to the geologists and asks, does geology have laws? And unfortunately, the geologists sort of blocked in this image they have of their science that is at odds with their practice, say, well, no, we don't think so, really. Again, this is another way of making that point. It's also the case that the logical empiricists, including Hempel, believe, and we'll come back, and these threads all interact, believe that science is a unified whole. And following Carnap, they believe that the way to understand unification of science is not that science has a common method or that scientists have a common attitude, but that unification is a logical deduction from the laws of physics and chemistry. Now, this is in English, there's an expression, damned if you do and damned if you don't. And this is what the geologists found themselves in, because if geological theories can be derived from the laws of physics and chemistry, then they are scientific, but simply merely derivative, and therefore of no special interest. On the other hand, if the geological theories cannot be derived from the laws of physics, then they are not scientific, and hence of no interest to the philosopher of science. So whether, if you have the unified science model, geology, and actually, the biologists were fighting this battle too at this time. Biology was in a slightly better position than geology, but not much. Well,
we had Darwin.
You had Darwin, that helped, yes. So the philosophers of science weren't going to be interested, whichever way you answered this question, about the unity of science and explanation. Third line goes more to what you might call the social epistemology of science. And this is some research that I have done, but I haven't really yet written up. So it may be less familiar ground. There was a long tradition of debate from 1750 to 1950 among leading scientists and statesmen of science, I call them statesmen of science, about the nature of the progress of the sciences. And just to name some names, D'Alembert, Cuvier, Whewell, Comte, Dubois-Reymond, Berthelot, Marc, Duhem, the logical empiricists, the English crystallographer J.D. Bernal, Conant at Harvard, all debate, not in person, in the literature, about how to classify the sciences, what the methods of science are, of what value the sciences are to society. We've largely forgotten that tradition because they won. What they wanted to do with this long series of debates was to get a place for the sciences in the universities. Traditionally, the socially useful intellectual activities from the point of people with money, whether it was the church or the government, were the humanities, where you could learn rhetoric, history, and how to govern. And the sciences didn't have at that time a great deal of promise here. So the scientists set about trying to elicit from the practice of science what its value was to society. By the 1950s, in most countries, they have won because science has a place in the educational system and because most countries have national science funding agencies, whether it's CONACYT or the National Science Foundation or what have you. But for this 200-year period, what the scientists all argue, they differ about how to classify the sciences, they differ about what the method of science is, they differ about all kinds of things. What is a science? Whether science is unified. But what they don't differ about is that the value of the sciences to society is as a model of rationality that can be extended to the messy business of governing the people. So the value of science is it's social and moral and cultural value. That's what science is all about. By the time you get to the logical empiricists, they have decided that, and there's been back and forth on this all the way through, but that only if you assume science is a unity, and a unity with this hierarchical structure of physics and chemistry at the top and logical deduction, are you going to be able to persuade the powers that be, or are you going to be able to understand science as appropriate to governing society? And they have a series of outreach events and activities and organizations to promote this view of the unity of science. There's a very good book by Kaminga and Thompson, if you're interested in this issue, called Pursuing the Unity of Science, and it's in the. So some of these projects, they have a group at Harvard, for example. It starts with Neurath in the Vienna Circle, and when everybody moves from Germany and Austria to the United States during the war or before the war, they bring this idea with them, and they get people at Harvard enthused on the unity of science idea. They set up, they intend to produce an international encyclopedia of unified science that didn't have many actual publications, though it did have one that was very influential, Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. They are able to, after the war, talk to international organizations and persuade them that there should be a scientific component in, and that the organization should in fact be modeled on the Republic of Letters, the community of scientists, or the community of science for organizations like UNESCO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, and WHO. So this was actually kind of delivering on their vision of the relations between science and society. But again, geology doesn't fit. If you go back to this page at the end, if you look down how people actually make their way, the first three in this list are the philosophers and the rest of the geologists. And the two, I think Kulkin was there just because he happened to be at Southern Methodist University, but Nelson Goodman taught at Harvard almost all his life and had a large private fortune, which he had made as an art dealer. And Carl Hempel, Peter Hempel, had taught at Heidelberg, Berlin, Chicago, and Princeton for highly elite universities. Then you get to the geologists. Now, these are no pikers. I mean, you've got three presidents of the Geological Society of America there. But Hubbard, who was probably the most famous geologist in America at the time, worked for Shell Oil. Harry Hess did teach at Princeton, but he worked in the Navy all his life and remained in the Navy in the reserves as a rear admiral. Galuli worked for the U.S. Geological Survey. Betts was the secretary of the survey. Harrison was director of the Survey of Canada. Mason Hill worked for Richfield Oil. Luna Leopold worked for the survey, and Albritton was in the university. So basically, the geologists, and this was certainly true when I was studying geology, you did not see the university as a career. you went into the oil companies or you went into the Geological Survey, and the Geological Survey was mapping largely for mineral resources. If you were one of this group in the war, you had been in the military looking for mineral resources or surveying the seafloor bottom for submarine warfare. So there's a huge social difference and cultural difference. The geologists, and this is not new, the geologists, geology had always been tightly tied to the exploitation of mineral resources. In the first geological institutions are not in the universities, they're the mining schools in in Freiburg and Chemnitz and Mexico in the 18th century. And this is where the action was. It was to do with silver mining or coal mining or canal building or railway building or good agricultural land or water management. In fact, M. King Hubbert, I think he was alone in this, actually signed up for something called the technocracy movement, which was quite strong in the 1930s. An engineer called Howard Scott set up something called Technocracy Incorporated. And his idea of how society should be governed was that you should get rid of the current way of governing societies with elite products of the universities, and in its place, you should put technocrats and engineers who would rationally allocate resources instead of leaving it to liberal economists and the capitalist system. I don't think any of the other geologists signed up, but in the 1930s, Hubbert actually wrote a long technocracy study course, which began with the history of the Earth and Earth resources and physics and chemistry, and went up through politics and economics. So you have two radically opposed visions of what the scientists should be doing in society, because even if the rest of the geologists did not sign up for Technocracy Incorporated and did not think that engineers should be running the countries, they certainly saw their function not as eliciting rational models of rational thought, but as of one of tending to the Earth's resources. So it's not really surprising that, when I plunged into the history and philosophy of geology in the 1960s and 70s, there was, kind of just incomprehension. I mean, why would you do this on the part of historians and philosophers of science? I mean, why waste your time? I missed out a little teeny bit. Okay, if you wanted to, yeah, it's on the next, I'll just say it quickly. On the next page. Insofar also at this time, as people in the universities looked at technology, it was a real rejection of technology. Not necessarily a rejection. One view that sort of was associated with not logical empiricism, but it was a kind of assumption that all philosophers of science had, was that technology was applied science. And the atom bomb helped this. You just do your science, and then there's a bit of a lag. Technological lag was a big topic of discussion in the 60s and 70s. Why did it take so long to get from science to technology? But it got there, and technology was simply applied science. And of course, since it was simply mere applied science, it was of no philosophical interest. The other line by the sort of continental philosophical tradition was that technology was of interest, but it was of interest because it was a terrible threat to humanity, particularly large modern technology. And so you get this slew of books, anticipated by Mumford in the 1930s, but with Jacques Ellul, The Technological Society, and Herbert Marcuse, One-Dimensional Man, that come out in the 1960s, arguing that the technological direction of society is a disaster. So again, wherever you turn in academia, whether it's the analytic, logical empiricist tradition or the continental tradition, again, technology is out, and insofar as geology is technological, geology is out as well. Okay, let me finish up. You'd have thought this would have changed in the 1970s because you've suddenly got a big reaction against logical empiricism with the so-called post-positivists, Toulmin, Russell Hanson, Kuhn, Feyerabend. In retrospect, we sort of say Kuhn, but there was a whole slew of people at this time criticizing various parts of the logical empiricist tradition. A bit later, you get a lot of people like Peter Gallison and John Dupree criticizing the unity of science thesis. And geology itself is changing because, thanks to the work of a lot of these people, in the mid to late 1970s, plate tectonics breaks. And I remember I was sitting in the British Museum reading room one day, and one of my former geology teachers came in. I can't think why, because they didn't normally frequent libraries. But anyway, we chatted, and he said, "Rachel, do you know what's happened in geology?" And I said, "Well, what's happened in geology?" He said, "Go and get Scientific American. You better read up on this." And this was an issue of Scientific American that really sort of broke the world news to the public that plate tectonics was a really serious theory. And of course, plate tectonics should have made philosophers much more sympathetic, because there's a lot of geophysical and geochemical work that went into plate tectonics. And in fact, because of that, by 1977, we were actually able to get a session at the Philosophy of Science Association meeting called David Kitts, who had written on the structure of geology, Hank Frankel, who did a wonderful series of 4 books for Cambridge University Press on plate tectonics, and me. We were able to get a session there, and it was quite well attended. But really, nothing much happened. And because at this conference in Boston in March of this year, that I started my talk with, arranged by Alyssa Bokulich, the general consensus was, we really do need to get a philosophy of the geosciences off the ground. We have a few people writing on it, but not very many. And I can't give you an explanation for, why because philosophy of biology has taken off, and it's now perfectly respectable, has its own tradition, its own questions, its own interests, but it's maybe partly numbers. There are far, far more people doing philosophy of biology and biology than there are geology. But I can't answer it here. But the participants all agreed in this conference that it was very hard to get geology treated as something more than mere or just, in those mere geology, just chronology. Not really a serious science. It was a Cinderella science, in short, to use the term introduced by my friend Roy Porter, the historian who wrote a great book on the making of geology in 1977. So there you are.
Well, thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Rachel, I didn't ask you, can you take questions?
Of course, yes, I can.
Yeah, okay. So, ahora vamos a abrir la sesión a una sesión de comentarios y preguntas. Supongo que empezamos por aquí o hacemos un champurrado. Bueno, como me vayan apareciendo manos aquí, en vivo o en diferido, las vamos dando. Rachel puede escuchar las preguntas en español, es perfectamente bilingüe, aunque no perfectamente, pero entenderá las preguntas.
Yes.
Si es necesario hacer alguna traducción, se hará, pero no creo que sea necesario. En todo caso, ella responderá a su elección en inglés o en español. Ambrosio, tiene la primera.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Rachel, además por la cortesía de facilitarnos hablar en español, a lo que nos cuesta el trabajo hablar en inglés. Yo tengo un par de preguntas. La primera es que, bueno, hacia finales del siglo XIX, un filósofo de las ciencias sociales de las ciencias históricas, Rickert, hizo una distinción entre ciencias ideográficas y ciencias nomológicas, argumentando que depende del punto de vista y el interés del quien estudia, no de la naturaleza misma. Y ponía como ejemplo la geología, exactamente, diciendo que es una ciencia ideográfica, no nomológica. Es decir, a diferencia de las nomológicas, según Rickert, tiene un librito muy famoso que se llama Ciencia Cultural y Ciencia Natural, traducido al español, y ponía como ejemplo la geología, de que estudia la naturaleza, pero desde el interés específico de comprender cada acontecimiento histórico, y le llamaba ideográficas. No sé si esto tuvo, esta es la primera pregunta, si al parecer no tuvo ningún impacto, ninguna relevancia en geología. Es un alemán.
Creo que no, nunca he leído ni oído nada explicación de sus ideas.
Okay. Bueno, la segunda pregunta es muy breve y tiene que ver con el desarrollo de la geología. Tú lo mencionaste. En México o en países periféricos.
Sí.
Mencionaste con toda razón el Seminario de Minería, que es una institución fundamental de las reformas borbónicas. Y ahí es muy interesante, bueno, primero las relaciones, orientado a la tecnología y dependiente de un proyecto de las reformas borbónicas, de hacer más eficiente la dominación y la explotación de los recursos naturales para aumentar la extracción, clarísimamente. Y bueno, no sé si en esa línea que estamos hablando, pues, hay algunos estudios específicos de esta orientación claramente tecnológica, que fue, por cierto, confrontada de manera muy interesante por algunos científicos mexicanos, particularmente José Antonio Alzar, que quizás es uno de los más distinguidos científicos divulgadores de la ciencia a finales del siglo XVIII. Y en particular algo muy interesante es que la mayoría de los profesores, si no todos los profesores del Real Seminario de Minerías eran españoles. Y había un desprecio a tanto los geólogos o minerólogos, eran minerólogos, criollos mexicanos, y también Alzate es una defensa muy interesante de los saberes tradicionales. Dice, reta al mejor profesor de mineralogía de la Real Seminario, del Real Seminario, a que compita con una de sus pepenadoras, mujeres indígenas, dice, que con el solo golpe del martillo sobre la piedra pueden determinar con mayor precisión la cantidad de metal, de oro, de plata, que tiene. Y lo que se resiste, no sé si este tipo de ciencia periférica y sobre todo del reconocimiento de saberes tradicionales
por parte de un ilustrado como es Alzate, tenga algún parangón en otras historias de la geología, los conocimientos tradicionales.
Bien, voy a responder en inglés a eso. No, this is really interesting. Yes, I mean, there's this mineralogical tradition that goes from Germany to Spain and then to Mexico and presumably Peru. Another of the aspects that I didn't go into, but it's tightly tied into the question of the function of science in society is who is the scientist. And not only, and I think one reason, I'll come back to this, why, for example, the stratigraphic tradition has been so stressed in English history of geology, is that the stratigraphic tradition was largely, that is, you know, from the discovery of time, was undertaken by gentlemen. And it was an intellectual activity that fitted into the elite idea of science. Whereas mineralogy, which was the dominant tradition, was undertaken by engineers. In the cameralist tradition in Germany, and there's an interesting paper talking about the relation between the Bourbonic reforms in Mexico and the cameralist tradition of mining in Germany. The state wants to take over the knowledge of the miners. There's a wonderful new book out by a guy called Thomas Morell called Underground Geometry, about the knowledge of German miners about how to survey underground where you can't see from one point to another. And that in the late 18th century, with these reforms, the state, whether it's Spain or Saxony or wherever, wants to take over that knowledge and make it accessible to the state. So I can't answer the indigenous knowledge particularly, but these mining areas are always on the periphery. So it is the state reaching out into the periphery and trying to bring it under control, trying to get Guanajuato into the hands of Madrid. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Godfrey.
Raquel, muchas gracias por tu extendida charla. Te quiero hacer una pregunta para ver tu reacción y tu respuesta, que tiene que ver con lo que David Christian ha escrito recientemente, una serie de artículos sobre la revolución cronométrica del siglo XX, que es pues el establecimiento de métodos cronométricos, ¿no? Carbono 14, etcétera. Y lo que dice David Christian es que hay una revolución, hubo una revolución a mediados del siglo XX en la datación del tiempo, en geología, paleontología y finalmente cosmología, que es, como ahora sabemos, la edad de la Tierra, la edad del cosmos, etcétera, ¿no? Quizás, si no apareció la geología en Hempel, en los autores que mencionaste del siglo XX, es porque tenían una idea de ciencia reducida a leyes, reducida a explicaciones, una idea muy minimalista de lo que es la ciencia. porque si consideramos la ciencia como una de sus tareas, datar el tiempo, pues entonces todas las revoluciones científicas tienen que ver con datación del tiempo de diferentes formas, desde Kepler, Einstein, Darwin, ¿no? Entonces, la pregunta es, ¿no te parece que si cambiáramos la noción de ciencia, si ampliáramos la noción de ciencia e incluyéramos cómo datamos el tiempo, entonces la geología tendría un lugar central en el siglo XX, porque es la primera vez en la historia de la ciencia, siglo XX, en que pudimos elaborar relojes para datar el tiempo profundo con seguridad. ¿Tú qué piensas al respecto?
No conozco el trabajo de David Christian, entonces no sé si entiendo correctamente la pregunta, pero creo que estamos hablando de dos sentidos de tiempo aquí. Hay este sentido de cronología, que es sencillamente una cosa después de arreglarlos en orden. Es verdad que también hay otro sentido, tener datos sobre los años pasados, cuántos años. Y eso, claro, en el medio del siglo XX, en geología, fue un área de mucho progreso. Ellos desarrolló muchas maneras de hacer eso. Es otra cosa, y eso no fue parte de este debate. Estoy completamente de acuerdo que es el ejemplo, imagen de ciencia es muy restringido. Y estoy de acuerdo contigo de que hay que expandirlo y entonces sí. Pero creo que no es importante no combinar el sentido tradicional de stratigraphy con el trabajo de gente como Zoina sobre cómo decidir la edad exacta y preciso de formaciones en el pasado.
Sí,
Gracias.
Sí, gracias. Esta es una pregunta muy en la línea de la de Gottfried, porque a mí me costaba pensar la geología como una Cinderella science. Justamente porque en la filosofía de la historia hay una obsesión con la geología. Todos están dialogando con la geología.
¿Verdad?
Sí.
¿Ahora?
Actualmente. De hecho, los números monográficos en las principales revistas de historia de la filosofía son en diálogo con geólogos o personas interesadas con la geología, porque lo que están pensando desde este marco de lo que han llamado el antropoceno.
Por eso sí.
Exacto. Y entonces lo que la geología aporta a la filosofía de la historia son otras escalas de tiempo y escalas en términos espaciales. Hay un descentramiento del humano que nos permite pensar la historia donde justo no son las personas o las civilizaciones el centro de estas. Y entonces yo diría que la geología es la reina ciencia actualmente.
Bueno, perfecto, estoy muy contento.
Sí.
Pero bueno, este era más bien un comentario en ese sentido, y donde además también hay una reflexión filosófica sobre la arqueología, al menos desde la
Pero lo
filosofía.
interesante es que eso no ha entrado en los debates entre los geólogos interesados en la geología como esos en Boston. Entonces hay que combinarlos. Y no, yo no sabía de eso, pero hace unos años había un poco de interés en big history. Diciendo que no podemos empezar la historia con los seres humanos, tenemos que ponerlos en un panorama más amplio.
Sí, porque además invita a otra noción del tiempo no lineal, ¿no? Entonces también por eso ha sido muy...
Well, tengo que pensar. No.
Vivet, no veo a nadie todavía por ahí arriba. O sea.
Thank you, Rachel. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about your own work on the history of plate tectonics in the context in which you were developing it, because I can imagine you surrounded by male historians and philosophers of science who are the ones who produce the general models of scientific explanation and scientific change. Yet you are resisting the urge to map on one of these models of scientific change onto the reception of plate tectonics. You are looking instead at controversy surrounding the reception, the theories, and more importantly, the practices of geology with respect to the reception or rejection of plate tectonics. And in doing so, you showed us a different way of doing history and philosophy of science. How was this?
Thank you, Vivek. I think that's a little overstated, but I'm very grateful anyway. The philosophers did not really react to plate tectonics. I tried talking to Kuhn about it a couple of times, and he wasn't interested. The geologists, as you know, to a person said, we've had a Kuhnian revolution. Yeah. I mean, it was a very traumatic time for geologists because, and this is not, please, they were not hostile to continental drift in general. I was taught continental drift. Everybody was taught continental drift. And the general line was, it would be really lovely if this theory were right, because we would love a general theory of the Earth. But unfortunately, it just doesn't have enough evidence. And why, let me talk about plate tectonics succeeded, not because geologists finally let the blinkers drop from in front of their eyes. It changed for two reasons. One, there was much more evidence and different evidence, and the evidence was incredibly persuasive because it was predictive and it came from a variety of fields. So whether you were a person who wanted a large variety of evidence or whether you wanted prediction, the new evidence in geology from the seafloor spreading and changes of geomagnetic direction, or whether it was the direction of certain kinds of plates, the evidence was incredibly much stronger. The other thing that happened with plate tectonics was that you had a different concept of the Earth. In continental drift, the basic division of the rocks of the Earth, and this really is basic, the rocks of the continents are different from the rocks of the ocean floor. And because of this, nobody could see how the rocks of the continents which were tougher, basically, than the rocks of the continental floor, the ocean floor could move through the ocean floor. With plate tectonics, they said the basic units of the Earth are not the continents and the oceans. The basic units are the plates. And the continents and oceans are welded together, and the divisions between them run along the mid-ocean ridges and the zones of subduction and these odd faults. So you've got it's a different theory. It's not the same theory. It's not the same ontology at all. That's just a digression, but I can't believe people are still saying, geologists finally realized that continental drift was right. Wrong. But it was traumatic for geologists because they'd known what they had to, within a period of 3 or 4 years, say that a large part of what they had taught their students was wrong. And that's a very hard thing to come to terms with. And so you look around for something to hang on to say, we weren't just being irrational, because they hadn't worked out the fact, I mean, they didn't have the kind of explanation I've just given you. And so they all turned to Kuhn. Which of course is terribly misleading because there is no incommensurability between the two. I mean, everybody understood continental drift and everybody understood plate tectonics. So you had to say, yes, there was this dramatic theoretical change. It didn't fit the Kuhnian model. And try to work it out. I don't think that, now, was this, can I link this to Vivette's sort of woman marching through a field of men hypothesis? I'm not sure whether that will work. Do you want to?
I mean, of the conversations we've had before, you often do say, I was a minority.
Yes.
Working among men.
Yeah.
And I was like on a daily basis having conversations with these philosophers of science who are working in a certain way. And I think you were working in a different way, much more akin to what we currently regard as
that could be.
Science based on practices, case studies.
That could well be. I feel I'm really out of touch with history and philosophy of science at the moment because I've been doing other things for many years. So you could be completely right about that, but you'll be the judge, not me.
Hola, muchas gracias por la plática. Estaba pensando yo en términos un poco de jerarquías profesionales y cómo no había este reconocimiento de la geología precisamente por la jerarquía que ocupaba dentro de las propias ciencias. Pero después con las intervenciones y en unas preguntas anteriores salió la ingeniería, ¿no? Y siempre hay como una disputa jerárquica muy fuerte entre las ciencias y los ingenieros, ¿no? Entre la física teórica y la física experimental, ¿no? Nosotros hacemos la teoría, ustedes nada más lo aplican, ¿no? Retomando como la discusión. Y entonces estaba pensando en esta última, en la tabla de la última página del handbook, ¿no? Y que justo nos señalabas que todas estas personas que estaban trabajando no estaban persiguiendo una carrera académica y científica, sino que se iban a las compañías de petróleo o a estas otras que eran más bien ciencias aplicadas. Pero ¿qué pasa cuando aparecen las ingenierías como la carrera en ingeniería petrolera, ¿no? Ahí esta disputa, no hay una disputa por la jerarquía y por ponerse por encima de los ingenieros petroleros por parte de los geólogos, donde empiezan a reconocer su quehacer como sí científico y no simple ingeniería. O sea, ¿hay algún análisis sobre la confrontación entre los geólogos puros, por decirlo de una manera, y los ingenieros petroleros y los demás?
Creo que no. Porque, por ejemplo, tomando Hubbard, él tenía porque él tenía esta teoría de peak oil, que hasta fracking, ¿cómo se llama? Fracking.
We don't translate that.
Su teoría de los reservas de petróleo fue un modelo muy aceptado, muy importante entre la economía, todo. Entonces, y quizás es un poco como mi hija trabaja en computación y su papá siempre le dice, ¿no quieres tomar un doctorado y trabajar en una universidad? No, nada importante en computación pasa en las universidades, es todo en Silicon Valley. Y yo no quiero ser universitaria. Quizás es lo mismo con geología. Es lo que quería. Sí, ellos, porque la gente en el survey, en oceanography, en el ejército y en las compañías petroleras tenía acceso a los datos más importantes. Ellos tienen toda la información. Y no, la gente no tenían recursos para recoger datos importantes y novedosos. Y por eso, plate tectonics, no, parte viene de las universidades, pero mucho afuera.
Yo tengo un par de preguntas, no sé.
Sí.
No te digo, no me vas fácil. Yo me pongo el final.
Bueno, yo, thank you very much. I mean, escuché la primera mitad en Zoom y la otra aquí, y me perdí un poco, tiene que ver con la pregunta de Marcia, me perdí un poco en la conexión con tecnología, y creo que la idea, puedo decir un poco cuál es la idea que creo, y tú me dices si está bien, si entendí lo que estabas tratando de decir. Porque mencionaste a Mumford y a estos filósofos de la tecnología, creo que en el siguiente sentido, o sea, la geología como que no era muy reconocida como una ciencia y fue aún menos reconocida una vez que se entendía a la tecnología como ciencia aplicada, porque entonces la geología pasó a ser ciencia aplicada y por lo tanto filosóficamente no interesante. Pero luego mencionaste esta, además, carencia dentro de la filosofía de la tecnología de, como que parecía haber una división, ¿no? O pensabas que la tecnología era ciencia aplicada, o habían estas visiones muy apocalípticas, ¿no? Dentro de la filosofía continental. Me da un poco de, sí entendí, entonces me da un poco de curiosidad ver cómo tú crees que esa, digamos, carencia dentro de la filosofía de la tecnología, si crees que jugó un papel también en no poder defender, por ejemplo, a la geología y darle un lugar.
¿Por qué esta carencia? No tengo respuesta excepto lo que ya he dicho, que en esta gran tradición de investigación de la vida intelectual o de investigación, hay pocos momentos cuando tecnología tiene un lugar importante. Hay momentos, D'Alembert, por ejemplo, en el medio del siglo XVIII, platicamos eso ayer, su clasificación de las ciencias y por él las ciencias fueron todos matemáticas. Y eso significaba la mecánica, la óptica, la astronomía, la geometría y la navegación y la fortificación. Y esos fueron las ciencias. Y él tenía matemáticas puras y mixtas, pero no aplicadas. No es una jerarquía, es sí, es su relación con el mundo actual. Pero por lo general, y creo quizás tiene solo que ver con el hecho de que hay este asunto de clases sociales, que las universidades y la tecnología son mundos apartes. En lo poco que yo sé de lo que pasa ahora y en historia y filosofía de la ciencia, me sugiere que ahora hay mucho interés en artesanía, en la vida, pero eso es solo en los últimos 20 años, ¿no?
Sí. Sí. ¿Alguna pregunta ahí en Zoom? No veo ninguna mano levantada. Aquí en el aula tampoco. No. Bueno, yo tengo dos líneas de pregunta. Las dos ya se tocaron de algún modo o de otro. Una tiene que ver con lo que estaba intentando hacer Vivetti, con éxito creo, de trasladar un poco tus preguntas, que es muy interesante el ejercicio que estás haciendo de reflexionar sobre lo que hicieron tú y otros estudiosos de las ciencias geológicas desde los 60 en adelante, pero de alguna manera tu presentación está un poco más en diálogo con los filósofos y los cambios en la filosofía y un poco menos con los historiadores y los cambios en la historiografía. Creo que tú, entre otras muchas aportaciones que has hecho a nuestras conversaciones y a nuestra comprensión, tienes trabajos sobre la historiografía y los usos de la historia de la ciencia y sus cambios en distintos momentos desde el siglo XVIII hasta ahora. Entonces, me interesa otra vez empujarte a ese momento en donde tú estás intentando hacer una historia de la geología en un panorama en donde la misma historiografía está fluida, ¿no? De algún modo el movimiento es el historicista, la historia empieza a cobrar, digamos, un lugar protagónico en los estudios de la ciencia, pero de algún modo no deja de estar jugando cierto papel secundario respecto a lo que les interesa a los filósofos o a los científicos, ¿no? Entonces, esta idea de que, por ejemplo, lo que el historiador le podía aportar a los geólogos con la tectónica de placas es paradigmas, ¿no? Entonces ya cuéntanos la historia de modo que ya tenemos paradigmas. Y hacemos una fiesta, finalmente podemos ser cunianos, ¿no? En fin, eso es como el ejemplo que tú nos das, pero mi pregunta tiene que ver con tú, ¿cómo viviste esas presiones de qué tipo de historia hacer y para quién hacerla? Ya no para glorificar a los científicos y ponerlos en un lugar especial ante la sociedad, porque eso ya se había hecho y como tú dices, ya había tenido éxito, ya no necesariamente para darles suministros o insumos a los filósofos que iban a terminar diciendo qué era científico y qué no, sino hacer una historia más para historiadores, pero no necesariamente para los historiadores tradicionales, sino historiadores de la ciencia. Entonces, digamos, ¿y qué pasó después? Porque ahí me da la impresión, y esa es un poco la segunda pregunta, que nos dejas un poco en ascuas cuando pasas de 1975 a 2023. Big gap, ¿no? ¿No? O por lo menos pensándolo en términos de la historia de la biología, es claro que como tú misma lo señalas, la idea de unidad, tanto metodológica como formal, como institucional mismo, pierde agarre y entonces se atomiza, ¿no? Se atomiza la biología, estoy pensando en la biología, ya no se concibe como unificada por un paradigma como es el darwinismo o el neodarwinismo, sino que empieza a haber una subespecialización, ¿no? Entonces ya cierta filosofía es de la biología molecular, y otra filosofía es de las grandes teorías históricas, y otra filosofía va por la taxonomía y las cosas formales, y ya es difícil a veces pensar que la filosofía de la biología tiene un centro, ¿no? Como la biología misma no deja de tener. No sé si en geología pasa un poco lo mismo, y digamos, con todo este además aumento de gentes trabajando en el área y aumento de estudios de caso y de incorporación de casos muy diversos, si pasó en la geología igual, que de alguna manera en estos 30 años, todas estas preguntas dejaron de tener peso y la gente gravitó más hacia estudios de caso específicos en donde había hibridaciones como nos cuenta Aurelia, con los problemas del antropoceno, con los problemas, digamos, otro tipo de problemas.
Mil disculpas por dejarlos en ascuas. Creo, me he preguntado por qué hay esta diferencia. Creo que no tengo los números, pero antes de este evento en Boston, googled número de bachelors en biología, physics y geología. Hay quizás 10 veces más en biología que en physics y 15, 20 más que en geología o los geosciences. Entonces, en parte es un campo mucho más pequeño. No es una respuesta intelectual. Y creo que había a lo mejor 15, 20 conferencias en este congreso, y sí, muy tratando temas muy distintos. No la antropocena, how do you say it in Spanish? Eso no apareció, pero el rol de las mujeres en la geología, mucha gente interesada en eso. La cuestión de impacto de fondos del ejército en la investigación geológica o geosciences, la naturaleza de clasificación en la mineralogía, no había unidad, unity at all. Y entonces espero que con el impulso de gente como Alisa, que ya ha persuadido the Philosophy of Science Journal para tener un lugar para papeles en artículos en filosofía de los geosciences. Vamos a ver lo que pasa en la biología, empezar a pasar con los geosciences, pero ha sido muy poco en estos años. Un poco aquí, un poco allá, pero no mucho.
Okay, thank you. ¿Algún otro comentario?
No,
Pregunta? Tenemos tiempo. Axel no va a preguntar. Qué raro. Bueno, parece que no. Bueno, pues entonces es el momento de agradecerle a Rachel su generosidad y invitarlos a que estén mañana en el homenaje a Larry Laudan y a darle un aplauso. Muchas gracias.
No tiene micrófono.
Ah, no tiene micrófono. Ya,